Greetings everybody, I hope you are having a good day. In this video I'm going to talk about a podcast episode of the Nicosia Uncut podcast in which hosts Andromakis Sophocleos and Kemal Baikali interview the co-producers of a documentary called The Divided Islands, Jay Sezi-Güzel and Andreas Tokalos. In this video, I will summarize the podcast and talk about, give my own reflections. In the episode, the producers talk about how they use personal stories to go beyond the dominant narratives, and they talk about people's reactions, and the conversation includes reflections on identity and expressions of hope. The producers of the documentary mention the need to embrace the past and trauma and to see how we can move forward. A recurring theme in the interview. They sought out viewpoints from people of a variety of viewpoints, including the nationalistic ones they disagreed with, because they were trying to allow people to tell their own stories of their traumas of lost land and loved ones, children, siblings, parents, some of whom still remain missing in a humanitarian way. They mention the story of a woman who wrote on her grave that if they find her husband, to bury him next to her. They also tell their own family's stories of trauma. They say that the response has been mostly positive, though they did get accusations of bias. Some of the younger people said that it helped them understand their parents better. Others found out it filled gaps in the narratives they were told where they felt something was off and they couldn't put their finger on them. That resonated with them. They said sometimes older generations had a hard time getting past their own trauma and seeing that the other side suffered as well, but others responded with empathy and expressed empathy for the other side. They mentioned older Greek Cypriots who were unaware of what happened to Turkish Cypriots in the 1960s, which involved being confined to enclaves. They then turned the conversation to identity, mentioning that they are proud of their respective Greek and Turkish Cypriot identities, but suggest that such pride should not be exclusive and should embrace all part of Cypriot identity: Greek, Turkish, Maronite, Latin, and the various immigrant communities. They say that we should not protect identity at the expense of losing the island, but to seek a common homeland embracing all identities. They conclude with hope, specifically mentioning the work of the hosts as contributing to hope and what happens when Cypriots work together. They say that Cyprus can host multiple identities if people can embrace it as a place they can live and raise their kids and have a future in, and see it as a place where flowers can bloom and people can prosper together. Now for my own reflections. I talk about my own connection to the island and meeting, and the impact meeting people has had, and also will allude to some theories I learned in my minor as a peace and conflict studies, and reflect on how the identity discussion affects my own country of the United States of America, and express my own connection and love for Cyprus. Disclaimer: I am not Cypriot. I am not of the Cypriot diaspora and have no Cypriot background as far as I know. However, I spent 9 months on the island for a Fulbright English teaching assistantship, ETA, and fell in love with it. Back in America, before I came to Cyprus, I read about the island and the Cyprus problem. This is actually how I found the podcast Nicosia Uncut, because I followed social media accounts from Cyprus, and it led to a domino effect of following more and more accounts. It is one thing to read about it before arriving in the country. It's another thing to be there, to be in English class where the teacher asks the Angelakia, little angels my term for the kids, how many of their families were refugees from the north, and to see a significant percentage of them raise their hands. It was a day around Christmas when they decorated a tree with photos of people who went missing in 1974, and I helped. One of the kids saw me looking at the pictures and trying to read the Greek and told me that his great uncle was missing for 26 years and that some people are still missing after 50 years. I read the book The Traitors Club by Marina Christophidis and have met her myself. I hung out with a group every Saturday that her book is about, so I recognize the name she mentions. I did not know what happened to the Turkish Cypriots in the 1960s before I read her book, and her personal account of the Turkish invasion in the sort of Kyrenia where she lived is just chilling. I said all this to say this. It is something else when people you know are personally affected by these situations. During my time there, I have sought to mostly listen empathetically to whatever people say, but I must admit I was involved with the Unite Cyprus types. But I would try to listen regardless of people's opinions, especially since I am from a country that hasn't been invaded in over 200 years and is more likely to invade other countries, and I was in a country that was invaded within living memory. And I do acknowledge the trauma, but I would also like to look at and briefly allude to some academic perspectives as a way of understanding the situation and moving forward. I minored in peace and conflict studies at Kent State in Ohio, the same school that is the theme of the Cosby, Still and Nash and Young song, Ohio. And one class I took was International Conflict Resolution. Analyzing the conflict would take another video, so I will just mention a few points. One concept mentioned in analyzing conflict is the idea of chosen glories and traumas by Vakim Volkan, who is Cypriot himself, how certain historical traumas and glories will play a role in identity formation. And Johann Golting mentions identity as a basic need, and it's also mentioned as a psychological conflict. And this is often reflected in holidays, and scholars note how rare holidays from medieval times are, that they mostly commemorate modern events such as independence and so forth, or ancient events tied to culture. And the podcast actually made me think of identity in my own country, the United States of America, with fierce debates over DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. The documentary producers had me thinking that if Cyprus could embrace all its identities while also making space for people to embrace their own, why can't America? There are concerns about groups not assimilating and talk about whose narratives are being told and ignored. Maybe, like with Cyprus, America can be embraced as a place people can live, raise their kids, have a future, and prosper together. I could embrace my own mixed ground, having a father of Croatian heritage and an African-American mother. I must acknowledge that in the debates that there are also concerns about power imbalances and certain stories being ignored at the expense of others. And I'm not sure how much of that plays a role in Cyprus, but still, that does not mean that America cannot learn from Cyprus. Back to the discussion of Cyprus. What stood out to me is the idea of Cyprus being able to host different identities if people can embrace it as a place they can live, raise their kids, have a future in, and see it as a place where flowers can blossom and people can prosper together, including immigrant communities. My 9 months in Cyprus really makes me say yes to all this and makes me think perhaps there is room for me on the island. Even though I have returned to America, I still have hope for the country that hosted me for 9 months. In the podcast, Andromakis Sophocleos and Kamel Baikali interviewed Jay Sezi Giselle and Andreas Tokalos, the producers of the Divided Island documentary. In the conversation, they talk about how acknowledging the past and trauma can help us move forward. They talk about interviewing people of a variety of persuasions, whether or not the producers disagreed or agreed. The reactions people had to their film, and they concluded with reflections on identity and expressions of hope. In my own reflection, I talk about how I, an American with no Cypriot background, developed a connection to the island and the contrast between reading about the Cyprus problem in America and actually meeting, talking to, and befriending people personally impacted or having family members personally impacted. I note some academic theories and mention the role of chosen traumas and of identity in analyzing conflicts. Though I note that analyzing the conflict is beyond the scope of this video, which is already long. I then reflect on the relevance of the discussion of identity to American culture wars and return to Cyprus to express my own connection to the island, stating that I do see it as a place I could live, raise kids, have a future, and prosper. I will include a link to the podcast in the description as well. Thank you for listening and have a good day. And please like and subscribe.